Welcome to episode 31 of the Lucretius Today podcast. Unfortunately, we don't have Elaine or Charles with us. It's going to be Martin and I. And so rather than read a new section, we thought the thing to do would be to extend the discussion from last week because there's been additional comments added at the Epicurean Friends Forum about what was said last week. And that would provide a basis for us to continue the discussion. So let me first point out that post number 3 in the thread by Don on Friday responded directly to what we said last week about the Polyaenus example and the life of someone such as a scientist who is enjoying his life from the pursuit of science and doesn't necessarily, in the viewpoint of some, need a wider philosophy if he's in fact experiencing pleasure through the pursuit of science. Even that description of the issue is open to challenge, but with that as the description of what was said last week, this is what Don said in response to that. He said, "This was a lively one," referring to the episode. He said, "I feel compelled to weigh in on the life of your fictitious scientist. I don't think one can just say that the pursuit of science, bringing the scientist pleasure, is the end of it. I seem to hear you saying that pleasure is the goal, the scientist experiences pleasure, and that's it. That's not the only aspect of the scientist's life we need to worry about. I agree that if the pursuit of science brings them pleasure, that's fine, but it cannot be the whole story and negate the need for the possession of a philosophy of life. I would ask, what is the totality of their life? How are they living it? Are they just? Are they making decisions to bring sustained pleasure to their whole life? The moment-by-moment experience of pleasure while researching or contemplating their scientific pursuit is not the goal. It is living a sustained, pleasurable life. That's why Epicurus stressed that sometimes we should experience pain for the sake of later pleasure, and why we should abstain from some pleasure for more pleasure later. It's not necessarily 24/7, 365 immersion in pleasurable feelings all the time for your average human, Epicurean or not. The importance of a framework or philosophy of life is how you deal with life when it isn't providing pleasure. How do you return to that? How do you react when someone close to you dies? How do you experience hardship, disease, disappointment, and so on? If experiencing individual pleasures is the only goal, and we come to this naturally, as I understand some of you were saying in this episode, of what use is Epicurus in his philosophy? If experiencing pleasure is the only important aspect of Epicureanism, and we naturally do this anyway, of what use is the philosophy at all? I have other things I could fill my time with. I keep coming back to Principal Doctrine 10's if, because it starts, if the pleasure of the profligate dispelled their fears and anxieties, we'd have no quarrel with them. But their pleasures don't dispel their fears. But they're experiencing pleasure, so it's all okay then? I have to say no to that. I don't think that's the goal Epicurus taught. They're not living a life that can be sustained in pleasure. Now, if they were demonstrating they understood how to make prudent decisions to sustain their pleasure, that death is nothing to them and why, etc., and not simply running after every pleasure all the time, then yeah, go forth and seize the day. I don't think that's what the lost, to translate the original word, are doing. And then likewise in the letter to Mencius, Don quotes the part that says, so when we say pleasure is the goal, we don't mean the pleasure of decadent people or the enjoyment of sleep, as is believed by those who are ignorant and don't understand us or who are ill-disposed to us, but to be free from bodily pain and mental disturbance. And then he underlines, for a pleasant life is produced not by drinking in endless parties and enjoying boys and women and consuming fish and other delicacies of an extravagant table, but, again underlined, by sober reasoning, searching out the cause of everything we accept or reject, and driving out opinions that cause the greatest trouble in the soul. And so Don concludes by saying, so the scientist's pleasure or joy in their work is fine as far as it goes. One should not tell them to stop. But pleasure or joy in that one thing is not the entirety of life. Okay, Martin, I think that's a pretty good summary of the issue that we were talking about last week. And then the conversation continued after that with some points by Godfrey, another participant on the forum. And Godfrey said this, and he's referring to you, Martin, when he says this. He said, just finished listening, great discussion. And then Godfrey says, to me, Martin said it most accurately and concisely. Quote, it's natural, unquote. Epicurus did not invent the canon. He observed and articulated it. It's a natural process involving pleasure. As long as nothing is interfering with this process, then no philosophy is necessary. But when wrong thinking, fears, religion, and such interfere with the process, then correct philosophy is the medicine to get back on track. So at least for now, I'm with Elaine and Martin. I guess that means he's not with Cassius. Don's points are well taken, however, and bring the discussion, he's not with Don. Don's points, however, are well taken and bring the discussion to the fullness of pleasure. If the scientist has arranged his life to maximize pleasure, then there's no reason to change. But if his marriage is a shambles, he's living on the streets, he's an alcoholic, etc., then he probably could use a philosophical intervention. In the latter case, his cup of pleasure is full of muddy water. Martin, do you remember at this point what he's referring to when he referred to you as saying that it's natural?
Yes, that is the point. I don't remember in what context I said it.
Yeah, I guess I'm reading the rest of that paragraph, and so he carries on referring to the fact that Epicurus didn't invent anything new. He was just observing what was there. And so the next sentence says it's a natural process involving pleasure. I think I'm interpreting it now as I read that. And of course, the next sentence, as long as nothing is interfering with this process, then no philosophy is necessary. I guess maybe that is the heart of the issue, is the perspective of whether there is a sort of natural state that should be our first concern, and that first concern is to be just pursuing pleasure, and the perspective that as long as we're successful in pursuing pleasure, then there's no philosophy necessary beyond that. Do you think that's what he's saying? And if he is, what do you think you're saying there?
Well, the thing is, I understand Godfrey the way you described now, and I do not fully agree with him. The thing is, if we do not have a philosophy, or explicitly think we don't have a philosophy, we implicitly have a philosophy. I see this, for example, with my wife. She says she's absolutely not interested in philosophy, but people nevertheless have an actual philosophy. It may be often very inconsistent and contradictory, but people people who know philosophy can figure this one out. No? I've seen this already in an article by, I'm not sure whether it's a philosopher or another person of humanities, who analyzed an article from a scientist which was critical of these humanities subjects. And he then, of course, that scientist himself wasn't really that much into philosophy, but then this humanities guys, he then really analyzed what philosophy apparently the scientist was using in the background, without being conscious of it. And that is the advantage of doing philosophy explicitly, that we get conscious about this one, that we see where the weak points are and to refine it, and also to do wrong classification. And one example in my case is that because not being clear about this, I didn't know before how to answer the questions when a close friend asked me whether I'm the idealist or materialist. Or I remember that I had this misconception that both Epicurus promoted minimalism and that I was pursuing minimalism, and the explicitly discussing this issue then turned out no, Epicurus does not push for minimalism, and I also do not apply minimalism. I just use elements of minimalism, but that doesn't make me a minimalist.
Right. I am going to be agreeing with everything that you just said, Martin, in several different ways. But before I go into and state anything further, what do you think if Elaine were here, remembering what she said last week? Do you think she would take the same position that you just said? Or if you try to put yourself in Elaine's shoes, is that her perspective too, as you interpreted it, or different?
I guess so, because, with her it was the same as with me. When she stumbled across Epicurus, then she saw, that is a philosophy I've been following all the way anyway. So we found out that our implicit philosophy has a fairly exact correspondence in existing explicit philosophy. And then, of course, it's just natural that we want to learn more about this and figure out the details. Right.
Okay. Before we go any further, I want to say this and put all sorts of caveats around it. I've in my life attempted to read many different viewpoints, many of which in the past I've read and currently reject, including the one I'm about to cite. But on the topic that you have raised, Martin, about everybody having an implicit philosophy, whether they acknowledge it or not, there was an essay by Ayn Rand called Philosophy, Who Needs It? That expanded on the point that you just made in a way that I've never forgotten. And still, although I reject so much of the rest of what I read in Ayn Rand, her point about that was, I think, exactly what you just said, that everybody has a programmed in orientation towards life and method of thinking, whether they're conscious of it or not. And if they're not conscious of it, what that means simply is that they have picked it up subconsciously, or just osmosis, if you want to use a term like that. They've picked it up from other people, from their parents, from their friends, from their churches, from the media, from whatever source, and they have not examined it, and they're just basically driving along like a herd because they haven't ever consciously examined, in many cases, or in most cases in what I'm referring to there, how they think themselves. And the orientation of wanting to examine your own thoughts and make sure that you're thinking in a way that you agree with consciously, I think seems to be very good. And maybe that's really the point of what we are talking about here, is if somebody wanted to take the extreme other position, they might say that, well, if those people without a specific philosophy are happy, then no one should have a problem with it. And so therefore philosophy is not necessary. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this one does not follow prudence. No? I mean, it's a principle of prudence that we want to make a good decision towards pleasure. And this is not assured if we just like what is now called the sheep. And another thing to say is that once the implicit philosophy has become explicit, I pursued it with a lot more confidence. Before that was a lot more doubt. Yeah, it could be like this or it could be like that. So there was an implicit tendency towards skepticism, and this one is now gone. So I'm a lot more confident that even though this philosophy is not an absolute philosophy, or that we can be sure it's absolutely right in something like that, it's one for a practical approach to life is just the best one to choose.
Again, I completely agree. You're saying that you're much more confident. I feel confident about the fact that we could probably also say that you're being much more successful in the application of it, because you've consciously begun to acknowledge some of the subtleties of it and seen potential errors in understanding or application that you could then course correct and become more successful in the way that you pursue it. So again, this would be another aspect of Epicurean philosophy, I guess. I don't think any Epicurean would argue that philosophy for the sake of philosophy was the goal. It's just a practical matter. It's not a theoretical issue that philosophy has a special status. God doesn't give philosophy a special status. What we're talking about is, you use the word prudence, we're talking about the practical way of life that successfully brings pleasure. Because if you're not using prudence and you're not using some degree of reflection, and again, I use the word course correction, then it's just extremely unlikely that you're going to be successful in achieving pleasure over a longer term. And now I'll say there, I always catch myself nowadays when I don't think long-term pleasure is a correct definition of the goal either, because the extent of time that the pleasure lasts is a factor. But I think Epicurus explicitly says in his letter to Menicius that it's not the primary factor, it's not the only factor. So even if your goal is to simply get onto the top of Mount Everest and stay there for 5 minutes because you think that experience of pleasure would be worth it to you, still you have to be prudent in the way you pursue that, or you're not going to be successful in getting to the top of Mount Everest. You'll freeze on your way to the top.
And regarding this philosopher, then the same thing applies as to the scientist. No? If that one is something for example, from a professional perspective, that this is what the person wants to do as his main thing to spend their life on, like for a professional career, the same thing applies. No? I mean, Epicurus himself is an example for that for him, doing the philosophy was the way to get maximum pleasure.
And I think he went even further and talked about that his study and exploration into natural phenomena and physics to some extent was really what gave him the pleasure as well. So it wasn't just that he enjoyed the logic of the debate. He really enjoyed the study of natural phenomena. But I think that's what he recommended. Among the things he recommended to people to do to get the best understanding of life itself is to study nature, basically in general, which is a scientific approach.
Yeah, but for this one, we need to then put in perspective that in ancient times there was no distinction between the subjects. So someone who would do one thing would do everything else basically as well. Typically, you know? There may have been exceptions, but anyone doing something in that direction was expected to be somewhat universal. And I think I saw this in somewhere else here as well mentioned. No? So that we are then also interested in other things. But to do this really at a practically professional level, I think the last person who was said to have been at that level maybe was the German playwright Goethe. No? And after that, things have become so specialized that it's basically one human just has the capacity to pretty much be up to date on everything what's going on. No? So the number of specialists in whatever has dramatically increased. No? So you can no more basically know everybody who matters in some way. And so 300 years ago, it was still possible to know every scholar around.
And it's not today. I think it would be interesting to continue on. In response to Godfrey's comment where he was talking about it's natural, I asked in response to that about how frequently that was going to be successful in sort of a general way of what we were just been discussing. And then Don responded further to Godfrey. I think that's probably worth reading here as well, because in response to what Godfrey said about the natural perspective, Don said, I think you raise good points, Godfrey, but I would posit that one's life doesn't have to be in shambles to need a philosophy of life to come back to. I'll freely admit that most people's default is simply to deal with life's situations at random as they arise. But how do we make sense of life's ups and downs? How do we deal with tragedy? How do we orient ourselves to have sustained pleasure? Do we experience pain and frustration and see no bigger reason for it? I do think that as infants, animals, including humans, seek to have their basic desires fulfilled to achieve pleasure. Look at the face of a sleeping infant with a full belly. But rapidly humans are acculturated. We learn to rationalize, to sublimate, to hide behind facades. Smiles everyone, as Mr. Rourke used to say on Fantasy Island. I think the answer to Cassius's question on how often there's no interference is rarely, if I understand his question. And I responded back to that yes, he did understand the question, and that's my perspective too, that it's rare that you're going to be successfully pursuing pleasure without interference from the outside or from bad ideas or bad views of religion.
I think the only person I would trust who would still do that is Elaine. I don't know of any other person who has it really that much ingrained and than her. Like that, before that I was a lot more doubtful and not clear about a lot of things, and that gives also uncertainty in decision making. And I think Elaine didn't. She is maybe the only person who has this so ingrained that she would be the one rare case.
I don't know if my laughing came through over the recording or not, but I totally agree. Elaine is an example of someone who has pursued rationality, science, her whole life. She's a successful physician, and she understands, I think, so much of what Epicurus was saying just instinctively and naturally without having had to have been prepared for it. Or maybe, I don't know the details of how Elaine got to the position she is in right now, but she certainly, I think, does embody that correctly. And so for somebody like that, I guess it can become so ingrained, and given your position in life, your circumstances may allow you to successfully just practice your job, practice your interests or your hobbies or the things that bring you joy. And for whatever reason in your circumstances, you don't encounter as much controversy or obstacle as other people do. I'm sure if Elaine were here, she would say that she's had all sorts of obstacles and just continues to have them, just like everybody else does. But I'm agreeing, Martin, that Elaine's perspective, like everybody's perspective, that should go without saying in everything we're talking about. None of us are disembodied brains. We all have individual personalities and contexts and likes and dislikes and abilities and disabilities and problems that factor into the picture and that explain how successful we're going to be in the pursuit of pleasure and how much time we have to devote to fighting outside negative influences and how much time we can just simply devote to experiencing pleasure in our normal activities. We could probably go on with that for a long time. Gosh, so many people have such difficult obstacles that they constantly confront, whether it's physical, mental, financial, political, all sorts, so many different obstacles to doing the things they'd like to do and experiencing the pleasure that they would like to experience. And so some people, through no fault of their own, have to devote tremendous amounts of time to trying to overcome those obstacles. And to me, it's obvious that the best way to overcome obstacles is using prudence and a philosophy and attacking things. That's the role of reason. You're using reason, you're attacking things rationally so as to achieve the pleasure, which is your goal. Your goal is not to be rational just for the sake of being rational. Your goal is to use rationality in order to overcome your obstacles and achieve your goals of pleasure. And so it just is going to vary widely how much time somebody has to devote to philosophy, I would think. And I think that probably explains the difference in perspective that we heard last week and that we're talking about now. And then I see another post from Don on the same subject, and then he went back to Godfrey and asked, Godfrey, when you say, quote, to me the default and the general rule is the natural state. Don said in response to that, is the natural state the experience of pleasure, the seeking of pleasure, or something else? I'm not being critical. I just want to make sure I understand what you're referring to. Same with Martin when he says it's natural. Is it the experience or the pursuit of pleasure that is the natural state to which we need to return? Martin, do you know what he's saying there?
Yeah, that is the thing. I think after this discussion, I need to listen to the discussion that I know exactly in what context I said this, and then I will then later on write a written note concluding that.
I see Godfrey responded to that comment from Don by saying, the natural state that I'm referring to is the smooth and integrated functioning of the sensations, prolepses, and feelings. So it would be the experience of pleasure functioning in a way as to be a proper guide for the pursuit of pleasure. And then Don said, got it. That helps and well stated, Godfrey. And I wish they were here to help clarify it for me exactly what we're talking about there. I think I'm beginning to gather where we're going and what we're discussing. But there clearly is a perspective issue, I think, that has to be clarified about what we're talking about. Martin, did you have any more thoughts about the Polyaenus example? I'm still thinking that the historical record, which Don has been very helpful in helping us clarify in this thread, is probably very closely on point to what we're talking about. There doesn't appear to be much in the text about the Polyaenus story, with the exception of what Don said. He's not mentioned a lot in the ancient text, but I think the dictionary entry above doesn't include Philodemus. Diogenes Laertius mentions him by name. One of the few specific ancient references is in Cicero's Academic, where Definibus has this passage, quote, it is also unworthy of a natural philosopher to deny the infinite divisibility of matter, an error that assuredly Epicurus would have avoided if he had been willing to let his friend Polyaenus teach him geometry instead of making Polyaenus himself unlearn it. So with references like that, the traditional commentary has come down to us that Polyaenus somehow was a great mathematician to start with, or geometrician, and then when he became an Epicurean, he just threw it aside and did not pay attention to it anymore. That's the traditional story. And then there's a passage in A Few Days in Athens where Francis Wright takes a different perspective on that and says that that's most likely just a totally incorrect perspective. But that's the point where I would ask you, Martin, do you have any additional thoughts on what the Polyaenus episode should represent for us?
Yeah, and the one thing is, to me, my best guess is that Cicero is being polemic here in this reference, so he's exaggerating it. The thing is, it could be that before joining Epicurus, Polyaenus was obsessed with geometry. And then if you then reach a certain level in this one and fame or something like that, and then you discover that there are other things in life to pursue as well, which apparently happened when he joined Epicurus, and it looks like he is no more geometrician, but I think he was still a geometrician. He just would no more dedicate whatever time he can to it. So he lost his obsession for it, but he still kept his passion for it, I guess. No? So he would just put in a more balanced life, no? As was discussed in this thread as well. And one more, it's more a minor thing to mention, but I've seen this elsewhere as well, so that people think that then a scientist would completely enjoy every step he's doing in his research as pleasure, and this is not the case. I found, because any real existing scientist will in almost all cases do just minute steps. And this can be extremely frustrating at times. Of course, the overall pleasure of doing science is there, but in the end, it could be that the total experience of pleasure in life is such that I do not really want to be a professional scientist, because then I'm doing too many unpleasant things. Or I experience too much pain, so to say, in really doing this at a professional level.
I think what you just said is essentially the understanding that Francis Wright takes in A Few Days in Athens, that he did not just all of a sudden stop pursuing geometry or mathematics, but he saw that there are also other important things in life other than simply mathematics and geometry.
Plus to add is that Cicero himself takes sides in this, that he himself is essentially was a Neoplatonist, and that means to him it appears just logic, the indivisibility of matter. So, and he takes this as an absolute truth, which meanwhile is pretty much refuted by science even. So that means he does not really see the point in here. So once you make this point, you do not see geometry as being an absolute truth in the actual world. But it's more like a tool for modeling, and that thinking was not there. No? So everybody, and in some sense, even Epicurus thinking was whatever we look at this there is towards the absolute truth. And we've gone away from this, that whatever we say about this world, essentially we create a model of it. No? And there is then the difference between the model and what is in some sense so really out there behind what we model. No? So there's more than just what the model expresses in it. And that is now something what is nowadays more clear, and that was at that time not. So at that time, Plato was really thinking that the geometry tells absolute truth about the world, and today's mathematicians think different on this one. Some of them may actually be Platonists in the sense that they think that we can suppose that there is this kind of ideal form, and they see the mathematics as something where this is actually exemplified. But they do no more claim that this is something what, just based on mathematics, is then what it tells the absolute truth about the world. It just in practical aspects, mathematics is a useful tool to do that typically, but there is no fundamental reason why it has to be like that the universe can be fairly accurately described mathematically.
Once again, I agree, Martin. During what you said, I know you made the point that maybe it was the worst problem in the ancient world, but possibly it is still a position taken by some mathematicians that they allow themselves to get so caught up into the model that they do begin to see almost mystical implications to it, whether they admit it or not, and whether it's in their own minds or not. I do think that that's the message that gets conveyed a lot of times that it's discussed. And it's fascinating. And you use the word also that I want to emphasize, is you said that you thought Cicero was being polemical or argumentative or just being very partisan in the way he's presenting this. And I think that's exactly what he's doing here. And this is a great example of it, of something we always have to be on the lookout that he's doing, and he probably does on a regular basis. Obviously, Cicero is devoted to the position that matter is infinitely divisible. And so that is Cicero's side, and he's arguing it. And so maybe Epicurus did convince Polyaenus that infinite divisibility was wrong. And maybe Polyaenus did switch sides on the issue. But for Cicero to describe Polyaenus as unlearning geometry or unlearning mathematics. It is a polemical, emotional, argumentative way of presenting it instead of just saying simply that Polyaenus used to have one position, and after talking to Epicurus, he adopted Epicurus's position. So I guess there's not enough historical record to really know what Polyaenus himself said about infinite divisibility or much else in particular, but that appears to be what's going on. The idea that Epicurus would suggest that somebody who is a scientist should just dramatically depart from that orientation is just ridiculous, because all of Epicurean philosophy in essence is sort of a scientific approach to life, of identifying what the goal should be and then pursuing the goal in an intelligent way. This has been a great discussion today, Martin. Thank you for being with me today. Next week, we'll hopefully be back at full strength with both Elaine and Charles. In the meantime, thanks for listening.